and welcome to today's ACMP sponsored webinar. We value our ACMP members, and if you're visiting us today, we hope you'll enjoy today's session. Our topic today is how to build an AI-enabled change management office. My name is Allie Hartman, member of the board of ACMP Global, and I will be your moderator for today. Registration is now open for our next in-person event, Change Orlando, from May 17th to May 20th of 2026. We have a limited number of discounted seats this year, so register now for your chance to experience cutting-edge insights and professional networking opportunities, and we hope to see you in Orlando. We have two featured webinars coming up to celebrate ACMP's 15th anniversary and the second annual Global Change Management Day. These are free and open to members and non-members. Register on our events page. Ready for others to see your expertise in change management? The CCMP proves your experience, aligns you to the standard for change management, and signals trusted ethical practice, so you stand out and move up. And our new Master Change Management Professional designation for those with their CCMPs highlights your mastery in the profession. Apply for either today. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available in the resource library within 48 hours. We will send out an email in the days following with a link that non-members can access. All audio lines have been muted. And ACMP has a new policy on AI note takers. They are no longer permitted during ACMP events. Should you like an accommodation exception, please email conference@acmpglobal.org. Today's webinar will run until 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have any questions during the presentation, post it in the Q&A. Questions for the presenters will be answered during and after the presentation. And be sure to join in the conversation and prompts from speakers in chat. And now I would like to welcome Nellie Wartoft, founder and CEO of Tiger Hall. Nellie, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ali, and great to see all of you here. No AI note takers in a webinar about AI. That's the world we're living in, right? It's constant figuring it out and where we go. All right. So we're going to spend an hour together today. Some of you might have spent some time with me before, seen me before. Thanks for coming back and spending more time. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Nellie Wartoft. I'm the founder and CEO of Tiger Hall. Tiger Hall is a change activation platform. So we support large enterprises, small enterprises in driving change and doing that faster, easier, better, and with a better experience for people going through a change. And what I'm going to talk about today is how do we build the AI-enabled change management office. And I know this title, Change Management Office, might be a little bit like I don't really have an office, and it's a change management team. Just think about how do we do change management at very large scale and very fast pace that we're now tasked with doing. Because I think this reality that we're living in, it's no news to anyone. I was on stage at a conference in Miami last week, and I asked people who was alive in 2016, and everyone was standing up, and I asked how many were driving change in 2016, and a lot of people were standing up as well. So many people have experienced this 2016 reality, right? And many of you here today might have been leading change for 10, 20 years, and you know what that was like. When you had a project, you could start it, you could finish it, you could do that end to end. Quite a different reality that we're living in today. When we look at this constantly overlapping pipeline of change initiatives, right? It's never ending. And if you ask anyone, do you have any initiative that has ever ended? The answer is usually no, because they just is changing and they turn into something else. And there's this constantly just having more and more and more. So I don't need to preach to the choir here. I know you're all living this day to day, that there is just more and more change happening. And with AI coming into the world and the picture, it's bringing this new inflection point, right? So there's always been more and more change happening. And there are many reasons for that, of course, like going way back, like technology and then the internet and then mobile, and like technology change tends to drive a big change. COVID was, of course, an accelerator from the way we work type of perspective. And then AI is bringing new inflection point. I do think what is very interesting with the way that AI bringing about change compared to previous technological changes is that AI is really not really a technology change, right? Like it's not just technology. It's changing processes, it's changing workflows, but it's also changing operating models, entire business models. And the change that AI is bringing about is so much more fundamental than what we saw with cloud or mobile or internet or some of these previous big technological shifts that we've seen in the last 20 years. And many times what is happening, right, is you start with a technology change, and that's how you think it is beginning. But then that leads to the process change. The process leads to operating model change, and operating model change leads to business model change, leading to culture change, and it just goes on and on. So we're having this perfect, like, holy moment where you have all of these types of changes driving and impacting each other, which is also what is leading to this explosion of it. And when you look at the way AI is driven in your organizations, from what I'm seeing, most of it is like IT tends to be involved, but it's very much a business change. And that's, again, different to previous technological shifts, right? We cannot just roll out a chatbot and call it done. It's about how do we change the way we think about work and the way that we operate as a business. And that's why we're seeing this inflection point. So Gartner is doing this research every year, right, about how many change impacts an employee is experiencing per year. And they started doing this in 2012, where it was like 1 or 2 changes a year per employee. And everyone was hunky-dory, like, okay, change of the year, let's go, I can do this. Now what we're seeing is this is starting to trickle up to 30 impacts per employee per year. Right now, 27 in 2025, and probably going to be 30, 35 in 2026. So that means more than 2 per month that is impacting each employee. And the question, of course, always outstanding, are we still calling it change? Is it just becoming business as usual? And that debate is ongoing. But this concept of always on change is something that everyone is living day to day. So when we look at the burning platform for transformation and what used to be like, oh, like, do we need this? Like, why are we doing it? Like, that's no longer up for debate, right? Like, we need to change and we need to transform. And OpenAI released a really interesting report in December. If you haven't read it, recommend reading it. It's called The State of Enterprise AI. And OpenAI looked at how are different enterprises adopting AI. And one of the things they said is the primary constraints for organizations are no longer model performance or tooling, but rather organizational readiness and implementation. So that's where the bottleneck is. And I'm not sure if you saw all of the things coming out of Davos. A lot of it was around how do we implement, how do we change, how do we transform? So the world is now laser focused on transformation. There's no longer this like, oh, do we need to change? Do we not need to change? No, we can probably stay as we are. Like, everyone needs to change. And what is interesting for all of you is how change management has now gotten so much more attention. And this realization that change management is super critical to realize the ROI of these major AI investments that are being made. And OpenAI continues, there are clear differences emerging in how AI is used across industries and among individuals within firms. And they say whether this gap widens or contracts will depend on how organizations approach change management. And this is rare, right? Like, we wouldn't really expect a few years ago for a large Silicon Valley tech company to come out and talk about change management. But that's now what they're advocating is the number one thing to realize ROI. And Aaron Levy, the CEO of Box, a large billion-dollar CMS company, he says companies will have to drive a substantial amount of change management to make this all work, because we imagine that AI systems would adapt to how we work, but it turns out due to their extreme power and inherent limitations, we will instead adapt to how they work. So that's a massive amount of change management involved in adapting to how technology works. So all of this as the backdrop from a macroeconomic point of view, like, how come that change management is so much in the focus right now? So a few years ago, the question was very much like, what is it? And I'm sure some of you are still battling with this question, like, what is change management? Why do we need it? What's the ROI on this? But it has very much shifted to, where is it? Where can we get more change management? How can we do this better? And how do we scale it? How do we get more and more of it, right? Like we might have a small change management team. How do we scale it across a large organization? And we've moved from this conversation on what's the ROI to how do we build change management as an embedded, compounding, always on capability. So I think you in this room and every ACMP member, you have the chance of a lifetime to do your life's work given what is happening in the world right now. Because change management has never been more needed. It's never been more critical to realize business ROI, and it's never been more in focus. Every week now, I'm in conversations with CEOs who are talking about change management. And when I started Tiger Hall 7 years ago, there was no CEO talking about change management. And now they're all talking about how do we drive better change management? How do we help people through change? And I was with a global head of R&D with one of the world's largest pharma companies. And he was talking about his number one priority was how does he help his large R&D organization go through change? Because it's going to be more and more and more. And he wants them to have a great experience. He wants them to be able to navigate through it. And 5-6 years ago, this was just unprecedented, right? That people at these senior levels on the business side spoke about change management. So I think you are in the perfect eye of the storm, and you can really harness this macroeconomic world that we're now in with AI driving so much change and really, really do your life's work. So that's a positive that this conversation has moved in this direction. However, as you probably know, reality tends to look very different still. And when you look at this, you might see that you are Mr. Manual Struggle, or you might know a Mr. Manual Struggle. When organizations talk about change management, they still tend to just, oh, let's hire this one guy and hope he can figure it out and just drive change across the entire organization, right? So some of you in the audience might be that one-man person. Put in the chat if you're like, are you a Mr. Manual Struggle? Are you a one-man person driving change in your organization, or do you have a larger team? I see some of you having 8 arms probably, so that is nothing uncommon. So this tends to still be the reality. Okay, let's just get one person in and hope they can make it right. We have some people saying, I am the manual struggle. Exactly. One person change. Yeah, very, very common still. Like we hire one headcount and let's hope they can drive change across the entire company. So the question then becomes, how do we drive scale, impact, and capability when we look at change? How do we move away from being that Mr. Manual Struggle, right? And underpinning that, if we want scale, impact, and capability, we need to do this with both humans and technology. And as the CEO of an AI company, I'll be the first one to say that we need humans. This is not about replacing humans. This is about doing it in human technology partnership. Because when we look at that amount of change that we now need to do as an industry, are you going to get 500 headcount approved to help you scale this across 50,000, 100,000 employees? Mostly not. So in the absence of getting all of those humans approved, all the headcount or consulting spend or whatever it is, how can you use technology to augment what you're doing? But it very much needs to go together. And I'm a big, big believer that technology takes away what is the non-human parts. So like Mr. Manual Struggle, all the manual struggle technology can take away so that you can focus on being more human and spending more time with humans. Because change at the end of the day is about humans. And I saw a really good comment on LinkedIn the other day where someone said that change is actually just about understanding basic human needs and understanding what happens when they are threatened. But somehow when we all walk into a corporate environment, then all of that turns into PowerPoint slides and frameworks and methodologies, and we just forget that it's basically all about basic human needs. And I think that's a great way to think about change, that at the end of the day, it is about humans, it is about basic human needs, and how do we cater to them when those basic human needs are being threatened, right? But human technology partnership is very, very key. So when we then think about how do we build the AI-enabled change management office, and more change management team, how do we do that leveraging what humans do best and doing that the human way, and then augment with technology? So what we're going to talk about in building this out, we're going to start with AI workflows. That's the phase 1 of building an AI-enabled change management practice. Starting with AI workflows, how do you implement them, where do you start, and so on. Then we're going to talk about decentralized change, because at some point, there's only so much change that a central team can do and push out to the organization, right? Like there are limits, even like no matter how great your team is, how many AI workflows, how fast you work, there are limits. So this concept of decentralized change is something that we need to put in place over the next 3 to 5 years, I think, to be able to handle the amount of change. So we'll talk about how we do that. And then phase 3, once that is nailed, how do we move to the change management office as the context layer, which is that ultimate operating model of being change as an overall embedded capability across the organization. So let's start with AI workflows. Who has done any AI workflows so far? When we look across planning, execution, analysis, just put in the chat, like give me a sense of what have you started with, what workflows have you applied AI to, any of these 9 on the screen or any other workflows as well. And if you have done nothing, just share that as well, like nothing yet. And this is a good way to learn within the group as well, because I'm just a point of one, but we have close to 300 people. Yeah, close to 300 people in the room. So lots to learn from. Nothing yet, nothing yet. Payroll. Interesting. Communications, process mapping. All right. Cross Microsoft Teams channel. Proofreading, custom GPT. Yeah, that's a good one. Custom GPTs for support help. Reports. Yeah, God, those reports. Chris, I've done a lot of OCM dashboard, change impact, champion network, and sentiment, risk assessments. Good. Okay. So it seems like we have a pretty good mix. Like some have done a lot, super exciting. Some have done nothing, and some are in between. And it's nice to see all the custom GPTs. It's a good use case. Awesome. So when you think about AI workflows, there are different ways that you can start. I recommend thinking of it as planning, execution, and analysis, and think of it in those 3 different areas. In the conversations I'm having, a lot of people have started with planning. So many tend to start with like change impact assessments, for example, or analysis, so like sentiment analysis from feedback surveys and so on. One of my recommendations is actually to start with the execution layer, because many times what I hear is people are starting with AI workflows across like planning, analysis, documentation, and that tends to be like a GPT. They could use something like ChatGPT or your own GPT internally, all the generative AI, right? Dumping documents into it and hashing that out and turning feedback data into an overall analysis and so on. Those are all well and great because they help you make you faster and so on. And these 9 on the screen here tend to be popular ones to start with. What tends to happen, though, is that you do all of that, and then you're still not seeing a difference in change adoption and the success of the initiative. So a lot of the conversations I'm having today is about how do we actually drive change in adoption, right? And making sure that change adoption happens, because that's ultimately where AI is very, very powerful. So if you started doing planning, analysis work, like that's all really great, and that helps the change management team, and especially for those of you who are the manual struggles of the world, that is a very good place to start, especially if you're one person or a small team. But when it comes to execution, this is where AI can have an even bigger impact and actually drive adoption, right? So sentiment, some of you are doing this already, and looking at like adoption signal detection, seeing like where are we seeing adoption, where are we not, and then correlate that back to sentiments, all forms of analysis. And then when it comes to communications and capability building, the personalization aspect of this is where AI can have the biggest impact, in my view, on the actual adoption, the outcome of the initiative. So if you haven't started thinking about this yet, this is a great place. And you can even start here, because many times, like, you might not have the data to do all the analysis and planning. That's a common pain point, like, oh, we don't have the data to do this. So start with execution that actually generates data and brings you the data to then do the planning and analysis. And what AI does really well, right, is you can take your strategy, you can take your change impact assessments, you can take any updates that happens to it, and then AI turns that into communications, capability building, training, activation, and personalizing it. And the reason this is so powerful, especially when it comes to adoption, is that it brings up relevance a ton. And when things become more relevant for people, then adoption goes up and fatigue goes down. Because you can do all this document AI workflows in the change management team, but still have an organization that is so change fatigued, right? So if you want to address change fatigue in adoption and the end outcome, personalization is where I think AI can have the biggest impact because of that relevance factor. And this is what we're seeing across people who are using it as well, is that it's affecting that end outcome. And this is when you then combine, so you have your personas, so you can have your audience segments or personas, you know what's important to them. You might have done like your persona profiling, combine that with what's the strategy. And then what AI does super well is looking at, this is what the persona needs, this is the strategy or the change, and then create communications, training, support materials, guidance, and so on. So that's having a big uptake on adoption. And if we look at a consumer goods company that did this, for example, they had a lot of fatigue, very high talent attrition. Everyone was overwhelmed with the amount of change because they kept blasting out emails and SharePoint sites to like everyone, and everyone got the same information. So they switched entirely to this super personalized, very targeted change activation, and had a big reduction in org-wide attrition as well. So what we saw there was very high change adoption. So that's the number one that it impacts. And then they measured something called the change confidence score, which I think is very interesting. It's basically asking people, how confident are you to lead through these upcoming changes? And how confident are you that your team will go through these changes? So looking at that change confidence score is something that they did. And then looking across a 3-year period, all of these savings that they saved from the reduction in attrition was a very big financial outcome for them. And what they did, very simple, like they took all the context. So you think of the context layer, SharePoint documents, strategy documents, all the process workflows, and then they turned that into personalized and relevant communications and training, got the feedback, and then that feedback further fed the context, right? Because then you can understand, this is what this group is going through, this is what they are impacted by, what their feedback is, their sentiment, what's their readiness, and being able to address different levels of readiness, different attitudes, different personal preferences, just drove change adoption super high. And also that they didn't get anything that wasn't for them, right? So it wasn't this overwhelming the organization with things that they didn't need. So when you look at AI workflows, you can start setting all of these up, and many of you are on that path already, setting up the workflows for the change management team, but start getting to that personalization aspect of AI. And that's when you're going to start seeing the uptake in adoption and the end outcomes as well, which is ultimately what change is supposed to drive, is to drive adoption of the change. Then looking at, let me see if there are any questions in the chat. Is it only as good as prompt engineering quality? That's a good question, Chris. So yeah, prompt engineering does make a difference, but it also depends on the model that you're using, right? So what's happening is that as models are getting better, like it's less, like you can do with worse prompt engineering, let's put it that way. So it is getting more and more easy to use it as like anyone without good prompt engineering. That being said, prompt engineering also does help. Yeah, it's many, like usually the longer prompt, the more details. When you have these details about the personas, if we go back here, like the sentiment, the personal preferences, the readiness, that's what you feed back into the prompt with these documents to then get the personalized engagement out of it as well. So prompt engineering matters, but models are also getting better. Can you give an example of the personalized change management and how it was scaled for stakeholders? Yeah, so take this, for example, let's take an ERP implementation that one of our customers did last year on Tiger Hall. So they looked at the ERP, they were switching from one system to another, and then looking at what are the workflow actions that people are taking in the old system, and then personalizing the training, the guidance, the timed reinforcement based on the behaviors they were taking in the old system. Because instead of going through, when you do an ERP implementations, right, like the change impacts, looking at which team are people in, who do they report to, where do they sit? Instead of doing that, you can actually just do the personas based on what are they already doing in the ERP today in the old system. So that gives you more, personas are more around like what they do rather than who they are. Because if you think of like processing a PO, for example, if you're processing a PO, doesn't matter if you're a finance manager in Spain or a sales manager in Mexico, like processing a PO in the system is the same thing. So why create those personas based on demographics or geographics instead of looking at what are they actually doing and what support do they need. So feeding that into context and then having the workflow documentation. So all your like SOPs and process mapping maps that together. Okay, this person is doing this. This is their readiness and their attitudes based on feedback, and then creating these micro nudges, communications, training materials that gets to them at the right time. And also then timing that. So when they take a certain action in the new system, that's when they trigger the communication and the training that they need to be able to do that new workflow. So looking at past behavior plus sentiment and bringing that together to formulate these micro nudges instead of putting everyone through the same training, regardless of which workflows they're using, just because they're all based in Spain, for example. So shifting from that demographic profiling to behavior profiling, and then using that to create the nudges, if that makes any sense. That's one example. All right, so we can do all of that. We can be a small change management team, do everything super fast, do all our AI workflows, and still not be able to do all the change that is needed, right? It's just impossible. Like most of the teams that we work with tend to be 2, 3, 4, 5 people driving change for 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people. So I usually say the ratio is like 1 to 10,000. And you can run a few like central CEO priorities with that kind of team. But at some point, you need to start decentralizing it as well, right? And I think as powerful as AI is today with those personal workflows and documents and personalization that we spoke about, and there's a ton you can do there today already, in the next 5 years, I think the biggest impact that AI will have on change management is that it will allow everyone to do change. And it will drive this shift from not having to be a change management expert to actually have everyone be able to do change. And if we think of these companies, to show a bit of an analogy to this background, which companies are these? You guess in the chat, do you recognize the logos? Stripe, Canva, Lovable. You are correct. It's Stripe, Canva, and Lovable. And what have they done in their respective fields? What's the shift? The answer is already there. They've driven this shift from expert to everyone. Exactly. Really good, Swetan Kumar. Democratizing the skills to people. Exactly. Made everyone able to do their services. Made complex things available to everyone. Spot on. Looking at Stripe in payments, they moved from having only banks be able to process payments to then have everyone be able to do payments. Same with Canva. Design, you don't have to be a designer anymore. You don't have to know how to use Adobe Photoshop. And Adobe Photoshop is great, but I have no idea how to use it. And most people who aren't proper designers do not. Canva, suddenly everyone can design, right? And the latest Lovable, not sure if any of you have tried Lovable or Replit or Cursor, one of their competitors, democratizing software development. Suddenly you don't have to be a software engineer to be able to code. Everyone can code. So if we look at these, what they've done is move the concept of you need to be an expert, you need to know everything, to suddenly everyone being able to do it. And this, I think, is the big shift that needs to happen in change management. We need to move from this, everyone needs to be certified and trained and have all the accreditations and certifications, to how do we make it easier for people to drive change, not harder. And right now, I still think many are making it harder for people to drive change. In order to drive change, you need to go through a 3-day workshop for $5,000 and get some certification. And I always say that you don't send a finance person to a medpic training, right? Like they wouldn't have to go through a whole like medpic training as the sales team do. And you also don't send a sales manager to complete their CFA certification. So why would you have everyone go through change management certification to be able to lead through change? We should do the opposite. We should make it easier for people to drive change. And when you think of Jevons paradox, have anyone heard of Jevons paradox? Anyone knows what this is? Get into my teacher mode a bit. No. All right. So Jevons paradox is basically when efficiency of something goes up, then the cost of it goes down. And what happens then is the demand for it actually increases. So this is the paradox, right? And this came from 100 years ago. There's a very old concept when we look at like steam engines and look at oil and coal. And at that point, whereas like efficiency became so much better in these different spaces. So suddenly it was cheaper, better, faster, and everyone can suddenly have a steam engine or get access to coal. And then what everyone thought was that, oh, given that now everyone can access it, it's so much cheaper, faster, better, the demand for it is actually going to drop. That was what people thought, because now it's so easy, so we're not going to see as much demand anymore because it's just going to be so easy to get. But then what happened was the opposite, and it just exploded, right? So suddenly everyone could have a steam engine, everyone could get coal, everyone could have electricity. And it's the same thing that has happened with computers. Like in the 70s, 80s, it was the big corporations that could have a computer, right? Then suddenly now everyone has a computer in our pockets and we all walk around with this and everyone has access to it. And this is the big shift in AI, and what is currently happening in AI is suddenly the efficiency of it, the ease of access is going down, and then demand will increase. So if we think of the impact that this would have on change, when AI in those workflows makes change work cheaper and faster to do, that's going to reduce the effort for each initiative when it comes to the change management side of it. And that will then increase demand for now we can do even more change. And even more change is already happening, but given the ease of it, it will continue to increase. So when we think of this from expert to everyone, then looking at the experts currently having all the experience, certifications, frameworks, models, methodologies, how do we democratize that so that everyone is able to actually do it? Because why should change management be something that only a few people can do when it's something that everyone is going through? It's the same like everyone learned how to host a meeting, how to draft an email, how to do everything else that were leadership, for example, like change management should be part of leadership. And not having to have a certification to be able to do change management, right? And what AI allows us to do is to have that natural language interface on top of it, where you can simply ask people, what is your team doing today that it shouldn't be doing tomorrow? What should your team be doing tomorrow that they aren't doing today? And then what will inspire or motivate them to get there? And this would allow managers at scale to be able to actually lead change, because we're not going to get there. We're not going to be successful in a decentralized model by making it harder and increasing the barrier. We're going to make it easier for people, and we're going to be able to make all of that change happen by enabling everyone to be able to do change. And if we can then train the AI, because assuming people will still have questions like, oh, do I have a job now as a change manager, right? Like what happens to the profession? What happens to my job? I have all of these certifications. Yes, you still have a job, because I believe it's still very much needed to train the model, making sure people can do it. But if you think of all your experience and expertise, baking that into something that everyone can access, I think is the big shift to how we're going to be able to do change at scale. And you all already have it, right? Like with a ChatGPT or any AI that you're using, that's basically PhD level output without you having to go and take a PhD. So can we do the same shift for change management? And when we then look at companies who have been, when companies have been doing this and looking across decentralization, having these small teams makes it it was one particular company that had big disconnect from the corporate culture, was very centralized in terms of the headquarters, and they wanted to decentralize the execution, basically making the change management and transformation office invisible and just having them as the enablers and coaches behind the scenes. And what they saw was much faster value realization, because people could relate to like, this is happening in my team, in my world, with my manager and so on. Major reduction in resistance when it was something that was closer to home as opposed to from a central HQ. And of course, that very big workload reduction for that central change management team. So, and they got governance balance right. So that's one thing to think about when you implement decentralization. Make the priorities clear, like what is it that you can do, what can you not do, and then coaching these managers ongoing based on the feedback that they're seeing on the ground. So when we think of like, does change management still have a job in this decentralized, democratized model? It very, very much does. And that's when it comes to the change management office as that context layer. Because then we've moved from having AI workflows, i.e. change management team does everything, and you have all of that execution happening, but with the help of AI, to then having AI help everyone do it, not just the central team, to then making the change management office as that context layer. And these will include different roles. So instead of having the change management team creating impact assessments and drafting communications and hosting trainings and so on, think of change management as providing context to what are the changes happening org-wide. Coordinating from a strategy point of view, there still needs to be a holistic strategy of what is it that we're changing, when and where, enabling all of these people who are driving change in their respective teams, training the AI. There will be a massive amount required for output training, verification, continuing deploying agents and training them, and with the feedback loops as well, doing feedback loop engineering. So when you see what is actually happening, then being able to fine-tune it ongoingly. So there will definitely still be a role for change management, but they will elevate the profession. So instead of having change managers today drafting communications and doing training and sending it out and so on, it will elevate the profession to actually be more strategic and enabling. And if we look at that from an operating model, right, looking at what it right now looks like in most organizations is you have change being this cascading motion where you might have the strategy set by C-suite. They work together with some internal or external people, could be consultants or internal teams. They delegate that to a transformation management office where the organizational change management sits together with a PMO. And then it's this cascading motion, right? Like, okay, let's take this to leadership. Let's engage the sponsors. And then the sponsors take it down to their managers. And then they continue cascading. And then you have very little data bubbling back up. So this is the traditional linear kind of project-based, downwards-based model. Whereas if we look at how a change management team will operate in an AI-enabled model where everyone is able to do change and you move that from expert to everyone, you have each of the different teams doing their own initiatives. So Team D might be doing 1, Team C doing 6. You have all of them doing their own initiatives. And OCM then sits as that context layer. So you will be able to have enterprise-wide visibility, intelligence, you have overview of everything that is happening. And your role essentially becomes to provide the context of what is going on, enable the strategy, making sure that people are aligned. Because if we have team A, B, C, and D going in 4 different directions, doing 4 different things that are not tied back together to the overarching enterprise strategy, right? That's going to be a problem. So your role in strategy coordination is going to be incredibly important when everyone is driving their own changes, right? So think of this like you don't have to sit as your small team of 3 or 4 and pump out everything across the organization, but you just enable the rest of the organization to actually drive change. And that's your expertise now. And it will still require a big amount of enablement and coaching, because at the end of the day, humans are humans. And I do still believe that we will need a lot of human interaction and human coaching and human enablement, but it's not going to be this one little team pushing everything out. And then there are new roles, right? So we spoke about the agent training, verification of output, like everything that is happening, continuously modifying the LLM, making sure that they put out the right content, that the feedback is used in the right way. There will be a whole slew of roles around making sure that the AI works for change management purposes, right? Because this is not general purpose AI that you can use for this. Like, it's not about putting the horizontal generic ChatGPT in for everyone, right? But this will be a purpose-built LLM and agent workflow based on change management methodology. So the methodology, the science, the frameworks, all of that is underneath. It just means that you don't have to train 2,000 managers in it. You can enable them to do it easier because you have that underlying platform context. Does that make any sense? Might not. And no one is here. No one is here so far. So if you are on this journey to shift into this operating model, I'd love to do a case study with you. I'm currently working with 2 large pharma companies on this particular shift. So they are the ones that, at least from what I know, that are furthest to this. So they are shifting into this as we speak. They're nowhere near done yet, but this is the shift that they're making. So big focus on decentralization, and then the central office becomes this enabler and strategy coordinator, and essentially oversight and governance, rather than the manual production of everything that is happening. So I'm doing that with 2 companies at the moment. If you are on that journey as well, please let me know. I would love to work together with you and study and do a case study together on this too. So where does that bring us then? If we look at the crawl, walk, run, if we look at starting with how do we just scale execution, right, and get a little bit better visibility from the way that we're doing change management today. Starting with, from an AI workflow point of view, with the execution workflow. So think of that personalization angle. How can you start applying AI in the execution and then later move to analysis and planning? Because many times you don't have the data to do the analysis and planning right away. But if you start with execution that generates that data, then you can use that data for analysis and planning in the walk and run. Change champions, I think many of you are doing this already. That's a great place to start from a decentralized change point of view. So that's the crawl, just have a change champion network that you work with, and then enabling more team ownership. And you can start working with your change champions and how do you make it easier for them, right? And you can start trying some of these things. Can you ask them natural language questions? And then that translates to the change management required for their specific team. And that will then eventually lead to team ownership. And then in the run is where we see this, the transformation office or change management office as the enablers of all change happening in the organization. And from a context layer point of view, start with that cross-org intelligence, the feedback loops. If you don't have feedback loops in place, then that's the very, very first place to start to make sure that you get that overview. Then starting with strategy coordination, giving context and input, and then finally where you have this context engineering come into play. So we look at it as these three different buckets. And just starting here is a great place to start, just scaling your own execution, implementing AI workflows, having some change champions that can start doing some of those workflows themselves, but then having the data come back to you. This is where most people are still, and where it's a good place to start as well if you haven't. So for those of you who said you're doing nothing, just start thinking about personalization, change champions, enabling them, and getting the data back. That's the very first step to start. And some things to not get stuck. Many say like, oh, we don't have any data. That's why starting with execution that can generate that data. So you have something to go back on. And then we're already up to our next with the current work. A lot of people say this, or like we don't have leadership buy-in to do this different approach. I always recommend just start with one initiative, something that you must do anyways, and then start executing differently for that specific initiative. And in most organizations, you would have one executive or leader who wants to be an early adopter and AI innovator. So finding them and starting with one of their initiatives and just start this execution in the crawl. How can you do personalization? How can you leverage AI for what you're implementing with them before you start doing the decentralized part? And then if IT doesn't allow you to use AI, then that's probably a harder part, and maybe go to an organization that isn't planning its own funeral right away. So those are some places to not get stuck, but very much start with the AI workflows, execution, and then building it from there. So once you have those in place, then you can start decentralizing, helping everyone to do it, and then you will become that context layer eventually. So I know this is very high level, and I know there's a lot more like detail and nuance that we can go into, especially on the AI workflows. You're always welcome to reach out to me and we can chat more about the AI workflows. This is more around how do we think to enable it at that very large scale in that horizon that we need for the long-term implications that AI will be driving. Because I think it's important to remember when we think of building an AI-enabled change management team, that we don't just start taking everything we're currently doing and spitting AI on top of it, right? And I see so many still doing that, like, oh, we're doing ABC, let's just AI-ify everything. And that's well and good, but it's only going to get you thus far. And that's why I'm advocating for this type of thinking, where how can we start thinking about that shift from expert to everyone? Can we start decentralizing it? How do we deploy it where it actually matters and help you in execution, as opposed to something that is like your own document management? So this way of thinking will enable that longer scaling. So that's in a nutshell what I wanted to share. Tiger also does a change activation maturity model. So if you want to test like where do you currently stand on the maturity side from a change activation point of view, you can take this test. It's an interactive assessment. So go to tiger.com/cam and you can see where are you at across things like communications, capability building, feedback loops, measurement, like where do you stand right now? So growing in that change activation maturity and enabling that with AI workflows to then take on this decentralized and becoming the context layer. So that's how we ultimately scale that always-on change and becoming that AI-enabled change and transformation office. And a lot of this you can do on Tigerhall as well. So when you think of the personalization, for example, that's a very big piece of Tigerhall's platform is to enable that personalization. So you have your strategy, your change, you have your personas or stakeholder groups. What Tigerhall does matches those, creates all the communications, capability building, nudges, personalized to the organization at scale, and enabling that decentralization. So if you have a change champion network or managers that you want to lead more change across the organization, great platform for them to get started with as well. So there are many things that we do in this space. So feel free to go to tigerhall.com and check out more of what we do and how we work with our customers. And I'm happy to take any questions that we might have. What does the Q&A look like?
Thank you, Nellie. Do you want me to curate or you want to go through it? Up to you.
I've not seen any of them. So if you want to curate, that would be great.
Okay, perfect. I've been noting them down. So we're gonna start off with one from somebody who is anonymous. Can you give examples of how AI can be used for measuring change saturation, overwhelm, and or fatigue? We have been struggling getting these metrics.
Yeah. So one way we're looking at this, so you need technology to deploy it in, right? So if I take what we do with Tigerhall, right, I'll share how it works on Tigerhall. Is you deploy the change on Tigerhall. It's personalized to every single person in the organization, and then that gives you an overall view of how they adopt it, what their feedback is, the saturation across different teams. It gives you those visuals. Doing that manually without a change activation platform, I think is hard. You can still do it with a Power BI, but you need a ton of different feedback metrics. You need a data lake. You need to pull all the feedback into a data lake. You need to correlate that with adoption metrics and then correlate that back to, say, like HRIS metrics to tell by like function and team. So you can be a data scientist and do it manually, or you can have a change activation platform like Tigerhall, for example, where you get all of those visualizations and data points. So yeah, but it's looking at the execution, the feedback, the load, and then you have visualizations around that. So those metrics are easier to get, but you need technology to get it.
Awesome. And Nicola is asking, so if you asked someone to write a comms message using this platform, someone who has no formal training in change management or comms or understands human dynamics, what model will it use to create the comms message? I think this is about like, how do you standardize across your org?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we advocate for is if you have a change management methodology that you're using or a framework, then training the AI on that. So what we do particularly is that we actually have this specific AI for each of our customers. They train it on their change management methodology, or rather, they tell us what the methodology is. We train the AI on it, and then everything comes out in their methodology. So if you have ADCAR, for example, like Tigerhall is based, you can do it on ADCAR, you can do it on any other model, you can do it on your own model. A lot of what we're building is the foundation is around ADCAR, but then you can also change it depending on if you do something special in your organization. But that's the good thing about AI is you can train it on these different models that you have.
Awesome. And Katie asks, I support public sector organizations who need to closely manage information privacy and are reluctant to broaden the use of AI tools. Have you worked with any public sector organizations to implement this technology?
We do. We work with the US federal government. We work with schools. We work with state governments. So yeah, we've worked with federal as well. A big thing tends to be where the data is hosted, if it's on-prem or in cloud, and which location and so on, and data security. So, but everything is containerized, so it's all secure in one environment.
Awesome. And we have another question from someone who is remaining anonymous. Can you give examples of what you mean by capability building? Is that using AI for execution or something else?
Capability building being like training, knowledge, learning, so anything that they need in the knowledge side. If you think of from ADCAR, like the K, the knowledge, that's capability building, and how we define it. And that could include like not just like training how to do something, but also like the mindsets around how to do something. If you need to change the way you approach certain things, and change the way you approach work, how you think about a process, all of that goes into capability building. But to simplify it, yeah, training and learning broadly.
We have another anonymous question. We worked hard to bring a CM and to centralize it. How does decentralizing it help? Would it not lead to not having the right amount of visibility and change fatigue?
Very good question. So that's like a lot of who are centralized, like that's good to centralize for that standardization. And when I say decentralized, like decentralized does not mean lack of standardization, just like anarchy across the organization. Decentralization in this concept means actually decentralizing what you're doing at a central level. So everything that you've standardized, playbooks that you've built, like everything, how can you enable more people to do what you already have built centrally? And I'm a strong advocate for a hybrid model. So it should never be one or the other. If you're doing everything centrally, it's just going to be really hard to scale. If you do everything decentralized, it's going to be rather chaotic. So you need a hybrid, but where technology can come in and help, and especially AI, is where you're able to then take what you already have centrally and enable at a decentralized level to execute what you've done centrally, if that makes any sense. So it's taking what you've built and what you have centrally and then enabling more people to do it.
Awesome. And Becky asks, my company is only just starting the OCM journey. We may have the opportunity to jump into the AI-enabled work. What might be the right starting point?
So for someone who's just starting out, I would recommend like the personalization is a really good place to start for the execution. Like if you're looking at how do we drive better change adoption and execution and making change happen, then that personalization workflow is the best to start with. If you're looking more like how can we start our journey as within the team, and just like being like think of it as efficiency metrics, then change impact assessment, sentiment analysis, those workflows are also good to start with. But the one that has the biggest impact on the outcome of the change tends to be that personalization side.
And then we have a question on, sorry about that, I just lost it. How can you put together a personalization plan without over-personalizing, i.e. making too many personas? Are there key buckets you usually put groups into?
Good question. So it's 3 different data sources that we recommend for personalization. So one being demographic, i.e. tenure is a good one to personalize on that most people forget, like how long has this person been with the organization. So tenure could be reporting lines, geography, function, like everything usually sits in your HRS. So HRS data, demographic data takes you, say, 30-40% of personalization. Then the second bucket is the workflow actions. And that's like the ERP example that I gave, like looking at what are the actions people are taking in specific workflows, what are they doing? So that could be like ERP is a very common example. You can also do it with, say, AI tools. Like we had one customer, for example, had this AI tool sitting across a SharePoint site, and they wanted people to use the AI search instead of going into SharePoint, and just seeing who's going into SharePoint, who's using the AI tool can then be used to personalize like how you want to communicate to people. And within that workflow actions, you also have frequency, like how often do they take the action, when are they taking the action, etc. And then the third bucket is what we call the transformation response data. And that includes sentiment, attitudes, change readiness, how do they respond to the particular change they're going through. So all of those together then forms the personalization. And what is important here is that the timing aspect, which is in that workflow action, becomes very important in personalization, because if you bombard everyone in January with the same training, for example, then people who are going to use something in July or October, they will need it later, right? So key in driving that relevance up is also to serve it when people need it, so that you create this just-in-time, on-demand experience of change, and that you don't go to the organization and push them and say like, hey, come for this 1-hour session or this 3-day training or this and that. And like, we're going to send you all of these emails today, but actually when something is impacting them, that's when they get the enablement. So the timing aspect becomes a big part of the personalization bit that also helps counter the fatigue and the saturation that you spoke about.
Do one last one from Rosaline, which is you talked about democratizing. We launched a change management advisory model that enables the function to execute the change and build the capability within the teams using our change management playbook. We have it centralized and now are working on decentralized. Is this what you are talking about?
With the decentralizing of that specific model? Sorry, I
Yeah,
missed it.
like like having the central playbook or the central advisory model and then making
Yeah.
it so that you can empower then the rest of the organization to start decentralizing that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. That's 100% what we refer to when we say decentralization. So decentralization does not mean anarchy and chaos. It means like what have you built? And then the big benefit of AI, right, is that you can actually train the AI on what is the methodology, the framework, and so on that you're using. And then allowing people to use that AI to create their own communications and training and feedback loops and support and nudges and so on based on the framework that you have. So think of yourself and your team as the architect of the framework, if we use like methodology or whatever you call it. But think of you as like you're the guardians of the science, let's say. And then that science, the methodology, the frameworks, then that gets deployed and decentralized with the rest of the organization. So yes, it's very much enabling someone else to do what you're doing without having them go through all the training and certification and years of experience and so on that you have, which is exactly, think of lovable Canvas Stripe, right? They don't need you to be a bank or a designer or a software developer. Suddenly everyone can build an app, even if you don't have 20 years experience in software development. That's the shift. But yeah, it's enabling what you've built centrally and enabling more people out in the organization to do it.
Thank you, Nellie. So yeah, that's pretty much the Q&A. There was a bit of overlap, so I hope I got everybody's questions. If we didn't get to your question specifically, do reach out to us. But yeah, I'll hand it over to the ACMP.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for participating in this ACMP webinar today, and I would especially like to thank Nellie Wartoft of Tiger Hall for that wonderful presentation. Immediately following the webinar, the feedback survey will pop up. Please take just a few moments to complete our survey, as your feedback helps us shape future webinars. And don't forget to join the webinar exchange community in ACMP Connect to continue the conversation and engage with our speakers and fellow participants. This recording will be available within 48 business hours in the webinar section in ACMP's resource library, located on the ACMP website at acmpglobal.org. And an email will go out to the non-members with a link to the webinar. If you already have your CCMP, remember that by attending webinars, you can earn PDUs toward maintaining your CCMP. So make sure you've recorded your hours today. And thank you all for coming, and we really look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you